Imagine walking into a mandatory corporate leadership retreat, right?
Oh boy.
Yeah, you're expecting the usual routine like trust falls, maybe a Myers-Briggs personality test, or, some seminar on workplace synergy.
Right, the standard HR playbook.
Exactly. But instead, the HR director dims the lights, hands you a diagram of an ancient multi-headed Gnostic serpent, and tells your team to uh, prepare for a cosmic battle against ignorant demonic entities known as archons.
Which just sounds completely unhinged. I mean, it sounds like the plot of a surrealist thriller.
It really does. But according to a massive new body of research, this exact scenario didn't just happen at a Fortune 500 defense contractor. It actually resulted in a 37% spike in productivity.
Yeah, and it completely upends our fundamental assumptions about how human beings, and specifically men, organize, compete, and find meaning.
Welcome to today's deep dive. We have a highly provocative, deeply controversial, and honestly incredibly intense mission today. We are exploring a new ebook titled Catholic Apocrypha Uncovered, Deciphering the Hidden Secrets of Non-Canonical Scriptures, and that's by Conrad Reicher.
It's a heavy read.
It is. And if you are listening to this right now, this deep dive has been specifically curated for you. Like, if you are a man looking to understand the history of our institutions, specifically how they operated before they were, as the author alleges, systematically captured by feminists and Marxists, and if you are searching for a historical roadmap to reclaim a robust, unapologetic masculinity, well, you are in exactly the right place.
Because Riker's premise is that the software that built Western civilization didn't just, naturally decay over time. He argues it was intentionally overwritten.
Right. But before we dive in, we need to make something crystal clear. This is our standard operating procedure. The source material we are looking at today contains highly charged, controversial, and ideological political and social viewpoints. As your guides, we are not taking sides, and we are not endorsing the viewpoints, politics, or ideologies contained in this book.
Exactly.
Our job is strictly to unpack the original source material, report impartially on the fascinating ideas Riker presents, and help you understand the arguments being made.
Right. Our focus is purely on the mechanisms. We are here to analyze the why and the how of his claims, regardless of where you personally stand on the whole political or social spectrum.
Absolutely. So to everyone listening, please take a second right now to like and subscribe to the show so we can keep bringing you these intense, unfiltered analyses. I also want to enthusiastically remind you to check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books right now to buy this ebook.
Having the text in front of you is going to be incredibly helpful as we navigate this.
For sure. And you can also follow the author, Conrad Reicher, at Conrad Reicher on Substack, if you want to follow along with this explosive material.
It is a very dense text, heavily reliant on obscure historical citations, so yeah, having the source material handy will absolutely enrich the experience.
Let's lay out the overarching architecture of Reicher's argument. He basically asserts that the Vatican, modern academia, and contemporary HR departments have all participated in this systematic suppression of ancient, banned Christian texts.
Right.
And the reason for this suppression. Reicher claims these non-canonical scriptures contained a masculine operating system, like a literal blueprint for male excellence, biological hierarchy, and uncompromising discipline.
And it's an operating system that directly threatens what he describes as the modern soy-fed establishment.
Yeah, so unpack that term for us, the masculine operating system.
The term is vital here. I mean, Riker is arguing that modern men are essentially being fed a gelded version of faith and society. He looks at early Christianity not as this, pacifist, turn-the-other-cheek therapy session, but as a pragmatic, highly militant field manual for survival and conquest.
Wow.
Yeah, and he traces the erasure of this manual to very specific inflection points in history.
So let's get into the cartography of that suppression. Because he doesn't just wave his hands and say, oh, history changed. He points to 367 AD as the first major system wipe.
Right, Athanasius of Alexandria.
Yeah, purging what he called dangerous texts. But I want to understand the why. Like, if I'm a bishop in the 4th century, why am I suddenly terrified of these specific scrolls?
Well, to understand Athanasius in 367 AD, you really have to understand the transition of Christianity from a persecuted, decentralized brotherhood into a state-sponsored bureaucracy.
Okay, that makes sense.
Athanasius' 39th Vestal letter is famous because it's the first time we see the 27 books of the New Testament listed exactly as they are today. Traditional history views this as a moment of, divine organizational clarity. But Riker, he views it as a corporate consolidation of power.
Ah, okay.
Riker's maxim here is that weak men build bureaucracies, while Spartan seed builds civilizations. The texts that Athanasius purged, and we're talking over 300 works here, they were dangerous precisely because they taught men to think autonomously.
So they taught a localized spiritual authority that completely bypassed the priest.
Exactly.
And if you bypass the priest, you threaten what Riker calls the sacramental economy. Can you break that term down for us? It seems central to why these bureaucracies function.
Yeah, so the sacramental economy is essentially a monopoly on salvation. Think of it like a subscription service for the divine.
A subscription service. Okay, I like that analogy.
Right. In a highly bureaucratic religious structure, you cannot access God, forgiveness, or spiritual initiation on your own. You must go through the authorized distributor, the priest.
You have to pay the toll.
Exactly. You must participate in the sacraments that only the institution can provide. The suppressed apocryphal texts, however, often featured men anointing themselves, finding the divine through direct physical struggle, or engaging in direct unmediated combat with spiritual forces.
Which means the middleman is cut out.
Yes. If a man realizes he doesn't need the institution to achieve spiritual excellence, the institution loses all its leverage. It can no longer tax him, control his behavior, or dictate his loyalties.
That makes perfect sense. It's a supply chain issue.
Yeah.
The institution needs to be the sole supplier of spiritual validation. And Riker traces this exact same bureaucratic anxiety through the centuries. I mean, he points to 1242, when French archivists burned 14,000 apocryphal scrolls.
Right.
Fast forward to 1974, and he highlights the Vatican quietly removing the prayer to St. Michael the Archangel from the standard Mass.
And that 1974 example is particularly telling for Riker. The prayer to St. Michael is a literal call to arms. It asks the Archangel to thrust Satan into hell and defend the faithful in battle.
It's intense.
It is. Riker views its removal in the wake of Vatican II as a deliberate castration of the faith's spiritual rigor, replacing a martial defensive posture with a more agreeable modern passivity. It's all part of the same continuous effort to overwrite the militant operating system.
But Riker doesn't just focus on the suppression. He focuses on what happens when that original operating system is actually allowed to boot up in the modern day. And the example he uses from the Ethiopian Orthodox Church is just incredible. Walk us through what happened in Addis Ababa.
Sure, it's a very vivid illustration of his thesis. Riker details this incident where a group of feminist protesters stormed a liturgy in Addis Ababa, attempting to disrupt the service to make an ideological point.
Right.
Now, if this happened in a modern Western institution, say an Episcopal church in New York or a corporate seminar in California, the response is entirely predictable.
Right. The leaders would likely pause, attempt to de-escalate, maybe call building security, and then issue a carefully worded PR statement apologizing for any harm caused while reaffirming their commitment to dialogue.
Exactly. The classic modern de-escalation playbook. Complete institutional paralysis in the face of direct confrontation.
But the Ethiopian deacons didn't do that.
They absolutely did not. According to Riker's account, they didn't reach for a microphone or call the police. The deacons physically defended the sanctuary.
Wow.
They took their heavy metal censers, the brass containers used to burn incense on long chains, and they literally swung them like medieval flails, physically driving the protesters out the doors. They protected the boundaries of their sacred space with immediate, uncompromising physical force.
And the most fascinating part of this anecdote isn't just the clash itself, but the data Riker presents regarding the aftermath. I mean, he claims this aggressive defense resulted in a 22% spike in Gen Z male attendance at that parish in the following quarter.
Yes, and that data point is crucial. Riker's analysis is that modern young men are starving for authentic order and authority. They're just suffocating under a regime of endless apologies and mediation.
Right.
When those young men saw an institution that actually believed in its own sanctity enough to physically fight for it, it triggered a primal resonance. It signaled to the male brain that this was a space worth respecting.
So for Riker, this is proof of concept.
Exactly. When ancient, uncompromising codes are applied, men respond instantly.
So if these texts in this operating system were so heavily purged and suppressed over 2 millennia, how did they survive?
Yeah.
Like, Riker brings up these fascinating historical rogues who essentially preserved the source code. Let's talk about Hans Miller.
Oh, Hans Müller. He was a Swiss mercenary operating during the brutal sack of Rome in 1527. Riker cites translated fragments of Müller's diary, which detail how he and his men literally broke into the Vatican vaults and stole 12 crates of what were labeled forbidden codices.
But Riker emphasizes that Miller wasn't just grabbing treasure to sell for gold, right? He actually understood the ideological value of what he was stealing.
That's the key distinction, yeah. Muller was a mercenary. He understood power. He realized that these texts contained the exact decentralized, self-reliant doctrines that the church had worked so hard to erase.
So by stealing them, he was stealing the institutional monopoly.
Yes. And what makes this relevant today is Riker's claim that Miller's original loot maps the routes and underground networks used to hide these texts are supposedly still circulating among certain exclusive networks.
Right, Riker claims that in 2020, a Texas men's group actually used these centuries-old maps to locate fragments of the Codex Chacos hidden in catacombs near Naples.
And those fragments specifically detailed initiation rites where early Christian men anointed themselves as spiritual leaders of their own households, completely bypassing the Roman clerical hierarchy.
I also want to touch on Werner Fischer because it brings this survival narrative right into the 20th century. This is an East German electrician in 1983 smuggling the Apocalypse of Peter past the Stasi. I mean, the Stasi were one of the most ruthless intelligence agencies in human history. Why are they so concerned with a second-century religious text?
Riker uses Fisher to demonstrate that the underlying fear of the establishment never actually changes, whether it's the 4th century Roman Empire or the 20th century Soviet bloc. Fisher smuggled the scrolls by rolling them up inside broken radio tubes.
That is so clever.
Yeah. And when he was later asked why he risked his life for old parchment, Fisher basically explained that totalitarian regimes, and by extension, modern corporate regimes, always fear the exact same thing: men who can think past the approved narrative.
Because the Apocalypse of Peter is notoriously brutal and uncompromising in its vision of justice and divine militant order, right?
Exactly. It presents a highly martial, unvarnished portrayal of Christian militancy. That perspective was deeply threatening to the state-sanctioned secular pacifism of the Cold War-era East German state. The Stasi wanted a predictable, manageable population.
Right.
A man answering to a higher, uncompromising militant code just cannot be easily blackmailed, managed, or coerced.
So if I'm understanding Riker's tech analogy here, these ancient texts are basically the root access or original source code for masculinity. And the establishment, whether it's Athanasius or a modern HR department, basically issued a patch to downgrade the system so men would be easier to manage.
That is an excellent way to conceptualize it. The bureaucracy wants you operating on the surface level, clicking the approved buttons. These texts grant root access. They allow men to bypass the user interface entirely and rewrite the rules of their own engagement.
But obviously, not every man in history had access to 12 crates of stolen Vatican codices. So if the original source code was erased from the archives, how did men continue to pass it on?
And that leads us directly into the visceral, physical rituals that bypass the mind entirely.
Exactly, which takes us straight into section 2 of his book, Hemoglobin, Iron, and the Neurochemistry of Brotherhood.
This is perhaps the most visceral part of Riker's entire argument. He asserts that the original operating system wasn't just written on parchment, it was written in the body.
Right, through physical rituals.
Yes, rituals that entirely bypassed the rational, intellectual mind. Riker claims that modern therapies speak this constant cultural demand for men to be vulnerable, to talk out their feelings, to sit in a circle and process their emotions, is biologically and sociologically catastrophic for male bonding.
He is aggressively dismissive of the modern safe space.
Yeah.
And he doesn't just make a cultural argument, he makes a deeply biological one. He argues that men do not bond through intellectual consensus or empathetic listening. They bond through shared physical pain and literal blood.
And he backs this up with some fascinating neurochemical data in his whole concept of combat anthropology.
Let's unpack that.
For decades, modern psychology has focused on oxytocin as the cuddle hormone, right? Associating it with maternal bonding and gentle affection. But Riker points to neurochemical studies showing how male biology processes these hormones differently under stress. According to the data he cites, male testosterone spikes 17% during high-stakes, competitive, or dangerous rituals. But more importantly, he cites that oxytocin spikes by a massive 400% during rituals involving shared, severe physical pain.
Wait, really? A 400% spike? Walk us through the mechanism there. Why does the male brain require physical trauma to release that bonding chemical?
From an evolutionary and combat anthropology perspective, words are incredibly cheap. Anyone can say, "Oh, I have your back." But the male brain, which evolved for tribal warfare and high-risk hunting, does not inherently trust a verbal contract.
It needs proof.
Yes, it is wired to look for tangible stakes. When you endure severe physical pain with another man, your brain receives an undeniable physiological signal. This person did not flee when things became dangerous or agonizing. The 400% oxytocin spike is the brain's way of permanently cementing loyalty to the men who bled with you, because historically your literal survival depended on them.
So to Riker, if a modern institution strips out physical rigor and replaces it with, like, a felt banner and an acoustic guitar, they are essentially short-circuiting the very neurochemistry that binds men to a cause.
Exactly. It explains why a modern church or a corporate retreat struggles to maintain male engagement, while young men will eagerly pay money to subject themselves to the grueling physical torture of a CrossFit workout or a jiu-jitsu dojo.
Right, the dojo provides the physical stress necessary to trigger the neurochemistry of brotherhood. The committee meeting does not.
Precisely.
And he illustrates this with an incredibly intense story from Helmand Province, Afghanistan, in 2012, involving a Marine recon team.
Yeah, according to Riker's account, this specific recon team was operating in horrific, isolated conditions. They eventually suffered 80% casualties. By all standard military metrics, unit cohesion should have completely collapsed. Desertion or a psychological break should have occurred.
But they had 0 desertions.
0. And Riker claims it wasn't because they remembered their Pentagon-mandated resilience training. It was because they engaged in a visceral, ancient ritual.
What exactly did they do?
They took a Coptic psalter, a book of ancient psalms, and they sliced a goat's throat over it. They mixed the animal's blood with the Afghan sand, and they smeared that mixture onto their dog tags in a binding blood oath.
Wow. I can hear the modern HR professional or Pentagon official gasping at that, calling it battlefield psychosis or a severe trauma response. But Riker views it entirely differently.
Riker calls it biochemical engineering. Those Marines instinctually hack their own neurochemistry. By introducing literal blood and shared transgression into their dynamic, they bypassed the rational fear of death and forged an unbreakable molecular bond. They reverted to the original operating system to survive.
That is heavy.
Yeah.
And then he contrasts this battlefield reality with modern college fraternities, which is a wild pivot. He specifically targets a situation at the University of Texas at Austin with the Sigma Alpha Epsilon chapter.
Right, so Riker uses fraternities as a microcosm of institutional decay. He notes that most modern fraternities have devolved into what he calls juice box initiations.
Juice box initiation.
Yeah, hazing that is humiliating but fundamentally physically safe. Having pledges wear silly costumes or do excessive chores doesn't trigger the ancient loyalty circuits, it just breeds resentment. But he claims this specific UT Austin chapter ditched the modern playbook entirely.
And they replaced it with something out of the 3rd century.
Yeah. They revived a Syrian blood pact derived from the apocryphal Acts of Thomas. Using sterile medical lancets to avoid modern infection, they actually drew real blood from the initiates, binding them in a shared, painful physical oath.
And the outcome of that.
Member retention jumped 87% in a single semester. Alumni donations from that specific pledge class skyrocketed. Meanwhile, Riker notes that a rival fraternity down the street, which was doing whipped cream pie pranks and trust falls, experienced a massive dropout rate.
So Riker argues it's all about the hemoglobin. You cannot fake the stakes.
Exactly. And he brings up medieval blacksmith guilds to reinforce this point. He notes that guilds used to literally mix human blood with molten iron during their oath-swearing ceremonies.
Oh, the concept of being bound in iron.
Yes. Riker claims the historical records show 0 breaches of trust or stolen trade secrets among guilds that use this blood iron ritual, compared to incredibly high violation rates among merchants who merely swore a verbal oath on a Bible in a courtroom. The physical integration of blood and iron acts as a molecular deterrent to betrayal.
And it isn't just military units or fraternities trying to claw back this primal hardware. He tells a hilarious but deeply telling story about the police in Sicily in 2017.
Oh, this is a perfect example of the collision between the ancient and the modern. The police in Palermo intercepted a suspicious wooden crate at the port. It was officially manifested as asti spumante, a sparkling wine.
Right.
But when they opened it, they didn't find wine. They found gallons of coagulated bull blood.
Their first thought was probably cartel activity or Satanism, right?
Naturally. But upon investigation, it was destined for a highly secretive, traditionalist local parish. According to Riker, they weren't Satanists at all. They were attempting to secretly revive the Mithraic Taurobolium.
Okay, break down the Taurobolium for us, because that is a very specific ancient Roman rite.
So Mithraism was a wildly popular mystery cult in the Roman military from the 1st to the 4th centuries. It was exclusively male, highly hierarchical, and deeply martial. The Taurobolium was their ultimate initiation rite.
What did they do?
An initiate would stand in a pit beneath a wooden grate. A massive bull would be slaughtered on the grate above him, and the initiate would be literally drenched in the hot blood of the animal. It was a baptism of extreme violence and physical reality.
Jeez.
Yeah. And Riker uses this modern Sicilian interception to prove that the male hunger for these visceral, high-stakes initiations hasn't disappeared. It has simply been driven underground by polite society.
Let me play devil's advocate here on behalf of the listener. Okay, let's unpack this. Riker is contrasting a modern safe space approach with literal blood oaths. Is his argument truly that unless there is physical pain, actual danger, or literal blood, the male brain will simply refuse to register an alliance as real?
That is precisely his argument, and he makes no apologies for it. Riker asserts that in our modern era, words have become entirely devalued. An HR department can redefine a policy overnight. A legal team can find a loophole in a contract. A person can say, I empathize with you while actively working to get you fired.
That's true.
Because words are cheap and easily manipulated by bureaucracies, the primal male circuitry defaults to the only metric that cannot be faked: physical sacrifice. If you have not suffered alongside someone, your nervous system does not recognize them as a brother. It views them merely as a temporary associate.
Which is a terrifying thought when you apply it to the modern workplace. We spend 40 to 60 hours a week with people we have never bled with, expecting loyalty. And that transition brings us exactly to Section 3 of Riker's analysis: the Gnostic war machine versus pagan HR departments. Because Riker takes all this ancient theology and combat anthropology and drops it right into the middle of modern corporate America.
This is where Riker's synthesis is genuinely groundbreaking. He argues that modern middle management and HR departments function as a literal demiurge.
Okay, we definitely need to explain the demiurge.
Yeah.
For the listener who hasn't studied 2nd century Gnosticism, what exactly is the demiurge and how on earth does it relate to human resources?
Right. In ancient Gnostic theology, the universe is dualistic. There is the true, hidden, divine spiritual realm, and then there is the flawed, material, physical world. The demiurge is a lesser, ignorant, and often malevolent creator god who built this flawed physical universe specifically to trap divine souls inside material bodies. The demiurge wants to keep humans distracted with physical suffering, rules, and illusions so they never realize their true divine nature and overthrow him.
That is a wild metaphor for middle management.
It is brilliant in its application, though. Riker argues that the corporate HR department is the modern demiurge. The divine spark is a man's natural drive, his ambition, his biological desire for hierarchy and conquest.
And HR traps that spark.
Yes, HR traps that divine masculine spark inside the material illusion of the corporate ecosystem, meaning meaningless KPI spreadsheets, DEI quotas, synergy meetings, and endless Zoom calls. HR creates an artificial world of rules designed to keep male talent pacified, distracted, and dependent, preventing them from realizing their own agency and taking power.
And the primary weapon the corporate demiurge uses, according to Riker, is the flattened hierarchy. The whole, we are a family, we are all equals on this team, there are no bosses, just leaders mentality.
Riker views the flattened hierarchy as a biological impossibility and a deliberate trap. When you tell a group of men that there is no hierarchy, you aren't actually eliminating the hierarchy, you are just forcing it to operate covertly, which leads to toxic, passive-aggressive backstabbing.
Because the hierarchy always exists.
Exactly. He cites historical precedent to prove that forced egalitarianism, these equality cults, always implode. He points specifically to the 1848 Oneida Colony in New York.
Let's unpack the Oneida Colony because it's a perfect case study.
The Oneida Colony was a utopian religious commune founded by John Humphrey Noyes. Their core doctrine was complex marriage. They believed that to truly achieve heaven on earth, they had to eliminate all exclusive attachments. Therefore, every man was married to every woman, and vice versa. They completely flattened the social and sexual hierarchy.
And how did biology respond to that?
It responded with absolute chaos. Riker details how the colony eventually tore itself apart through intense, suppressed male jealousy and the biological drive to protect and provide for specific offspring. You can enforce equality on paper, but you cannot legislate away the male neurochemical drive to establish a hierarchy, protect a mate, and secure legacy.
Right.
Riker says the Oneida Colony proves that hierarchy isn't a social construct imposed by evil capitalists. It is pre-installed biological software.
And he brings modern data to back up this ancient software. He cites a study from the MIT Sloan School of Management regarding decision-making in flat versus hierarchical teams.
The MIT data is damning for the modern corporate model. It shows that teams operating under a flattened, consensus-driven model take 3 times longer to make critical decisions compared to teams with a clear, rigid hierarchy.
3 times longer just to make a choice.
Yes. Because, as Riker colorfully puts it, forcing a diverse group of individuals with conflicting ideologies to reach an empathetic consensus isn't leadership, it's paralysis. In a crisis, you do not want a committee, you want a commander. The flat hierarchy stalls action, which, Riker argues, is exactly what the demiurge wants, a stagnant, manageable system.
But here is where it gets really interesting. Riker claims that while the elites are pushing this empathetic, flat hierarchy garbage on middle management and the working class, they are secretly using ruthless, ancient hierarchical models in their own boardrooms to consolidate power. Let's talk about Ironclad Solutions.
Ironclad Solutions is a Fortune 500 defense contractor. According to Riker's inside sources, they completely overhauled their executive leadership retreats. They threw out the standard Myers-Briggs personality tests, which just categorize people into harmless letters and replace them with Gnostic serpent diagrams.
How does that even work in a corporate setting?
Instead of looking at a supply chain bottleneck as a logistical error, the executives were trained to view it through a Gnostic dualistic framework. They reframed corporate inefficiencies as cosmic battles against ignorant archons.
And archons being the demonic enforcers of the demiurge.
Yes.
So they essentially turned quarterly earnings into a holy war.
Precisely. They tapped into the male biological drive for crusade and conquest. By framing their corporate goals not as increasing shareholder value, but as destroying the dark forces of inefficiency, they saw productivity metrics spike by 37%. They proved that men will work harder for a crusade than they will for a bonus check.
That is fascinating. It's like they're feeding everyone else a diet of junk food while they eat prime steak. And then Riker takes aim at one of the biggest targets on the planet, Jeff Bezos.
This is undoubtedly one of the most provocative claims in the entire book. Riker alleges that in the early 2000s, before the launch of Amazon Prime, Jeff Bezos spent 3 days isolated in a bunker in Texas, deeply studying the tripartite tractate.
Wait. Is there actual documentation of Bezos sitting in a bunker reading 2nd century Gnostic theology? Or is Riker connecting some very invisible dots here?
Well, Riker cites unnamed former early Amazon executives, so it must be taken as a highly provocative allegation rather than established public record. But the mechanism he outlines is what's truly compelling.
Okay, let's hear it.
The Tripartite Tractate is a major Valentinian Gnostic text that details how spiritual forces harvest light from lower ignorant realms by offering them a false sense of completion. Riker argues that Bezos used this exact theological framework to design Amazon Prime.
Wait, so how does a 2nd century harvesting text translate into 2-day free shipping?
Prime is designed to free consumers from material lack. Whatever you want, it arrives tomorrow. You never have to hunt or struggle. But paradoxically, by removing the struggle, it traps the consumer in an absolute dependency on the subscription model. Prime becomes the demiurge. It harvests your data, your money, and your localized independence in exchange for the illusion of limitless material comfort. Riker argues it is a perfect modern application of Valentinian Gnostic theology.
Man. To back up this theory of tech elites using covert frameworks, he brings up a leaked Amazon Venn diagram.
Right. This diagram supposedly circulated among top-tier Amazon Web Services architects. According to the leak Riker cites, the diagram directly overlaid KGB disinformation playbooks from the Cold War with AWS growth hacking strategies.
How does a KGB psychological operation map onto selling cloud storage?
The mechanism is actually brilliant. The KGB disinformation tactic relies on overwhelming a target population with fragmented, contradictory data until they lose trust in their own ability to make sense of reality.
Okay, makes sense.
Once they are sufficiently confused and overwhelmed, they will willingly surrender their autonomy to a centralized authority that promises to organize the chaos for them. Riker claims AWS uses the exact same psychological mechanism.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Yeah. By making the digital landscape incredibly complex, fragmented, and terrifying regarding cybersecurity, corporations voluntarily surrender all their localized data and autonomy to AWS, trusting the centralized cloud to protect them. It is a brutal, covert tactic to ensure total dependency.
Which completely shatters the public image of these companies as empathetic, progressive tech utopias. It brings us to the story of the Missouri Freight Company, which is essentially the ultimate rejection of this corporate demiurge.
This is a remarkable case study from the American Midwest. A mid-sized freight and logistics company was hemorrhaging money because shipments were constantly delayed. The delays were traced back to mandatory, endless HR seminars specifically, a multi-day pronoun and sensitivity training session that pulled drivers and dispatchers off the floor.
And the CEO's response.
According to Riker, the CEO fired the entire HR department mid-shift, just walked in and terminated the entire division.
And who did he replace them with? Because you still need someone to handle payroll and disputes.
He hired a former North Dakota oil roughneck to act as the sole personnel director. And this roughneck's mandate was entirely based on the Didache.
The Didache is one of the earliest known Christian manuals dating back to the 1st century. What specific rule did he implement?
The two ways rule. The Didache opens by stating, there are two ways, one of life and one of death, and there is a great difference between the two ways. The roughneck applied this binary theology to corporate logistics.
How?
Deliver results on time and you are on the way of life, you get paid and promoted. Make excuses, demand therapy, or create drama, and you are on the way of death, you were fired. No mediation, no performance improvement plans, no consensus building, just absolute brutal meritocracy.
If I'm understanding this correctly, the implication here is staggering. Riker is stating that empathy, the very thing we are taught, is the highest virtue in modern society, is actively being weaponized. The tech elites and corporate boards are feeding the middle and lower classes a diet of empathy, sensitivity training, and flattened hierarchies because it pacifies them. It makes them soft, agreeable, and incapable of organizing a true threat. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, those same elites are eating the prime steak of ancient cutthroat hierarchy to maintain absolute control.
That is the exact thesis. Empathy in the hands of the corporate demiurge is not a virtue, it is a pacification tool. By convincing the average male worker that ambition is toxic, that hierarchy is oppressive, and that he should just talk about his feelings instead of demanding power, the elites permanently eliminate their competition.
So if you were a guy listening to this right now, sitting in a cubicle answering a Slack message, Riker's telling you that the entire structure around you is a cage designed to harvest your energy. And your only way out is to recognize the true hierarchical nature of reality and leverage these ancient frameworks to build your own agency.
Exactly. You have to stop playing the game by the demiurge's rules. But Riker argues that the attack isn't just psychological or corporate. You can have all the mental frameworks you want, but if your physical vessel is compromised, you will still fail.
Which transitions us perfectly into Section 4, biohacking the divine and the anti-virtue signaling diet. Because Riker takes the concept of institutional suppression and applies it directly to the human endocrine system. He argues that the modern diet and environment are chemically engineered to neuter men.
Riker fundamentally rejects the modern Cartesian split between the mind and the body. In his worldview, you cannot have spiritual vitality if your endocrine health is collapsing. He looks at the widespread consumption of highly processed estrogenic foods and environmental toxins not as an accident of the Industrial Revolution, but as a deliberate tactic to lower male testosterone. He is the one who heavily popularized the critique of the soy boy.
He has a quote in the book, "Testosterone doesn't negotiate."
It perfectly encapsulates his biological philosophy. From a biochemical standpoint, high testosterone correlates with behaviors that are highly disagreeable to a bureaucracy, like risk-taking, boundary enforcement, competitiveness, and a refusal to submit to arbitrary authority.
Right.
A high testosterone male cannot be easily managed by an HR department. Therefore, Riker claims, the system attacks the male endocrine system to make the population more docile.
And he makes a wild historical connection here to back this up. He connects the 4th century Aryan bread subsidies directly to the modern United Nations 2030 sustainable diet. Let's unpack the Aryans first, because that requires some deep historical context.
So Arius was a priest in Alexandria in the early 4th century, and he sparked one of the biggest theological crises in history by arguing that Jesus was a created being, subordinate to God the Father rather than co-eternal. Athanasius, whom we discussed earlier, fought bitterly against the Arians. What Riker focuses on, however, isn't just the theology, but the political tactics.
Right. How did the Aryans gain so much power among the masses?
According to Riker's research, the Arian faction gained immense political leverage in the Roman Empire by securing control over massive grain shipments and instituting bread subsidies. Riker argues this wasn't charity, it was biological warfare. Yeah. By flooding the male population with highly processed, low-nutrient carbohydrates, they created widespread physical lethargy and insulin spikes. A sluggish, carb-heavy population is dependent on the state for its next meal and lacks the biological vitality to revolt.
And he draws a straight line from those Roman grain subsidies to the modern push for alternative proteins today.
Yes, specifically targeting the UN's push for plant-based diets and insect protein. Riker claims these are the modern equivalents of the Aryan bread subsidies engineered to weaken male physical resolve.
The insect protein part is specific. He talks about cricket flour and chitinase inhibitors. Can you explain the actual biochemistry of what he claims is happening there? Like, how does eating a cricket impact male hormones?
Riker cites studies analyzing the exoskeleton of insects, which are made of a fibrous substance called chitin. When humans ingest high amounts of chitin, our bodies produce an enzyme called chitinase to break it down. However, Riker points to fringe endocrine research suggesting that certain chitinase inhibitors compounds present in commercially processed insect flours actually interfere with the body's androgen receptors.
Oh, great. Yeah.
Essentially, he argues that these inhibitors bind to the receptors that are supposed to absorb testosterone, rendering the body's natural testosterone useless. He claims it literally nukes free testosterone levels, creating a biologically compliant male.
Man. So to combat this chemical pacification, Riker promotes what he calls the Apostle Arnold Plan.
It is an incredible fusion of aesthetics and theology. He blends the brutal physical bodybuilding ethos of a young Arnold Schwarzenegger with the Apostle Paul's strict labor ethics.
Paul was a tent maker, right? He insisted on working with his hands even while preaching.
Correct. Paul famously wrote, "If a man will not work, he shall not eat." Riker uses this to assert that grueling manual labor and the pursuit of physical muscular strength are not vanities. They are absolute prerequisites for spiritual clarity. You cannot defend the truth if you do not have the physical strength to enforce boundaries.
And he offers some extreme physical protocols to achieve this baseline of strength and purity. I want to talk about the testicle detox because that chapter is going to raise a lot of eyebrows.
It is certainly one of the most shared protocols from the book. Riker prescribes a highly specific dietary flush to rid the male body of estrogenic compounds. The core of the recipe involves 1 tablespoon of pure bentonite clay combined with medical-grade activated charcoal.
Why bentonite clay?
He roots it in the practices of the 4th century desert fathers, the early Christian monks who lived in the Egyptian deserts. They reportedly consume specific local clays to purify their gut biomes and survive on minimal rations.
Oh, that's interesting.
Riker claims that in modern terms, bentonite clay carries a negative electromagnetic charge. When ingested, he argues it moves through the digestive tract, acting like a magnet, binding to positively charged heavy metals and synthetic estrogens, and flushing them out of the body. He claims this ancient clay detox works better than any modern, expensive medical drip.
And according to Riker, you desperately need this detox because the modern environment is saturated with these chemical attacks. He cites a study from the Endocrine Society regarding store receipts.
This is a perfect example of Riker explaining the how. The Endocrine Society found that over 90% of U.S. currency and nearly all thermal paper used for store receipts are coated in BPA or bisphenol A.
Explain how BPA actually affects a man holding a receipt.
BPA is a highly effective endocrine disruptor. On a molecular level, its structure mimics estrogen. When you hold a thermal receipt, the BPA is absorbed transdermally directly through the skin of your fingers into your bloodstream.
You're kidding.
No. Once in the blood, the body mistakes the BPA for actual estrogen and begins downregulating natural testosterone production to compensate for what it thinks is a massive estrogen spike. Because men keep their wallets in their pockets, touching them constantly, Riker famously refers to the modern leather wallet as an estrogen transdermal delivery system.
That is horrifying. You think you're just buying a coffee, but chemically, you are being altered. So what does this all mean for the guy listening right now? Riker is essentially saying that your environment is booby-trapped. Every time you touch a receipt or drink a soy latte, you're losing a microscopic battle for your independence.
That is exactly the takeaway. Riker demands that men view their diet and their environment through the lens of asymmetric warfare.
This deep suspicion of the modern diet also leads Riker to take a massive swing at veganism. But he doesn't just critique it nutritionally, he critiques it theologically.
Right. He equates veganism directly to the ancient Gnostic lie. Remember, Gnosticism teaches that physical matter, blood, and the body are inherently evil or unimportant, and only the pure, ethereal spirit matters. Riker argues that modern veganism is just a secular rebranding of this heresy.
How so?
By refusing to consume animal flesh, he argues, a man is rejecting the natural, predatory, hierarchical reality of human biology. He is trying to live as a pure spirit, which inevitably leads to physical and psychological collapse.
He illustrates this with the tragic trajectory of Diego the Lion Sanchez, the former mixed martial arts fighter.
Sanchez was known for his incredible, almost feral ferocity in the octagon. He was a force of nature. But Riker tracks his career decline alongside his highly publicized adoption of a strict vegan diet.
And what happened?
According to Riker's analysis, as Sanchez eliminated meat, his grip strength plummeted, his explosive power vanished, and most importantly, his killer instinct evaporated. Riker brutally describes his physical state in later fights as resembling a wet noodle, directly correlating his loss of the championship title to his adoption of the Gnostic dietary lie.
Man. And Riker doesn't limit this phenomenon to humans. He includes this fascinating legal case involving a Missouri farmer named Jed Carter.
Jed Carter bred prize-winning, highly aggressive Angus bulls. Carter switched their feed to a new, heavily subsidized strain of GMO soy. Within months, these massive territorial animals became entirely passive. Carter ended up suing the agribusiness because his bulls turned into what he called docile lawn ornaments.
Did they ever figure out the biological mechanism there?
During the trial, veterinarian testimony revealed that the specific GMO soy was so dense with phytoestrogens that it fundamentally altered the bulls' endocrine systems. Their blood work showed that their testosterone levels had plummeted to match those of castrated house cats. For Riker, Jed Carter's farm is the ultimate terrifying metaphor. What the industrial food supply did to those bulls is exactly what the modern corporate and agricultural system is doing to the human male.
So if you allow your endocrine system to be chemically pacified, all the historical knowledge and mental toughness in the world will not save you. Your physiological resolve will collapse long before your ideological resolve does.
Exactly.
Okay, so you detox your body. You understand the corporate Gnostic game. You study the ancient texts and rebuild your neurochemistry. If a man manages to protect his mind, his career, and his biology, the final frontier, the ultimate target, according to Riker, is his legacy. How he protects his physical spaces, his marriage, and his children.
Which brings us to the fifth and final major section of our deep dive, reclaiming male spaces and the blueprint for Spartan sons. Here, Riker mounts an aggressive, historically grounded defense of the patriarchal household and the absolute non-negotiable necessity of exclusive male-only spaces.
He basically argues that whenever a society attempts to erase natural human dynamics, like the need for men to bond exclusively with other men just to enforce some modern standard of ideological purity or inclusivity, that society is driving straight toward a collapse.
And he traces this institutional fear of male spaces all the way back to antiquity. He spends a significant amount of time analyzing the Third Council of Carthage, which took place in 397 AD.
Let's explain it, like a 5 for a second. What exactly was the Council of Carthage, and what were they trying to accomplish?
The Council of Carthage was a massive gathering of bishops in North Africa. Their primary goal was to finally standardize the biblical canon to officially declare which books were in the Bible and which books were banned. One of the texts they officially banned was the Acts of Titus.
Why? What was so dangerous about the Acts of Titus?
According to standard historical theology, it was banned for dubious authorship. But Riker analyzes the specific passages that frightened the bishops. The Acts of Titus contained a rigid formula for what Riker calls male sanity.
What was the formula?
It demanded that men form closed brotherhoods based on 3 pillars: shared struggle, silent understanding, and sacrificial purpose. The text explicitly instructed men to handle their disputes and their trauma exclusively within this brotherhood, away from the eyes of women and the oversight of priests.
Because if a man can process his trauma and find his purpose inside a closed brotherhood, he doesn't need the bureaucracy.
Precisely. A self-regulating brotherhood is a direct threat to centralized clerical control. Riker argues the church banned the text because they wanted to ensure that the priest was the only valid mediator for a man's soul.
And Riker connects this ancient fear of male brotherhood directly to modern psychological data.
The data he pulls is staggering. He cites a recent CDC study analyzing male mental health outcomes. The study showed that men who participate in weekly, exclusive male-only groups, whether it's a boxing gym, a poker night, or a hunting camp, have 72% lower rates of clinical depression compared to men whose primary social outlets are mixed gender or couples-based.
72% is a massive statistical anomaly.
It proves Riker's point that men require spaces free from the unique social pressures and communication styles of women in order to decompress and regulate their own psychology.
He brings up a hilarious but deeply insightful historical example of this from 386 AD in Roman Britain. the Aquae bathhouse riot.
This is a fantastic anecdote. Aquasula's modern-day bath in England was a massive Roman bathhouse complex. Heavily combat-traumatized Roman soldiers stationed at Hadrian's Wall would travel there to decompress. According to archaeological records, Riker cites, early Christian preachers attempted to enforce mixed-gender public prayer sessions in the men's saunas, trying to sanitize the space.
And how did the legionaries respond?
They rioted. They physically threw the preachers out into the street, and the archaeologists discovered graffiti carved into the stone walls of the sauna that roughly translates to "no virgins in the sauna."
Ah, that's amazing.
Riker uses this as a blunt, ancient defense of single-sex sanctity. Men have always intuitively known they require spaces away from women and away from moralizing busybodies to speak freely, process trauma with dark humor, and rebuild their psychological armor.
And when you strip those spaces away in the modern era, the consequences are fatal.
Oh, well.
Riker brings up some incredibly stark data from the Department of Veterans Affairs in 2023.
Yes, the VA attempted to push combat veterans into mixed-gender, highly sanitized group therapy sessions focused on vulnerability and sharing feelings. The internal report showed that 89% of the combat vets surveyed demanded a return to single-sex, male-only therapy groups.
The quote he includes from one of those veterans is chilling.
It is. A veteran of the intense urban combat in Fallujah was asked why he refused to participate in the mixed-gender therapy. He stated on the record that he would rather eat a live grenade than cry about Fallujah in front of Karen from HR.
That quote just perfectly encapsulates the entire conflict.
It highlights the massive, dangerous disconnect between modern therapeutic culture, which demands emotional vulnerability in sanitized, highly regulated settings, and the actual psychological needs of men who have experienced genuine horrors. The modern system tries to treat a combat veteran like a delicate flower when what he actually needs is the blood and iron brotherhood of the Acts of Titus.
Which forces us to look at how this generation of men is supposed to raise the next. Because if the world is this hostile to male biology, how do you prepare your son for it? This is where Riker champions what he calls the fatherhood triad.
The fatherhood triad consists of discipline, skill mastery, and sacred texts. Riker contrasts this sharply with modern therapeutic parenting, or what we commonly call helicopter parenting, where the goal is to shield the child from all adversity and validate every emotion.
Riker calls it programming clarity, not cruelty. It's the ultimate anti-helicopter parent manifesto. It's like he's saying if you don't break your son's entitlement with a wrench and a carburetor, the world will break his spirit later. The examples he gives of the fatherhood triad in action are amazing. Let's talk about Rick Kowalski in Ohio.
Rick Kowalski's 16-year-old son came to him asking for permission and money to go on a first date with a girl he liked. A modern therapeutic parent would sit the boy down, have a sensitive talk about respect, emotional boundaries, and consent.
But Kowalski didn't do that.
No! Kowalski bought a rusted-out, non-functioning 1970 Chevy Nova, had it towed into the driveway, handed his son a wrench, and said, "Learn to rebuild this carburetor. Once this engine turns over, then we will discuss women."
And the mechanism behind that? Why a carburetor?
Because an engine does not care about your feelings. A carburetor is a masterclass in objective reality. If you assemble it incorrectly, it will not work no matter how much you cry or complain about it. Riker argues that by forcing his son to grapple with physical, mechanical frustration, Kowalski was teaching him emotional regulation, patience, and how to methodically solve a problem.
And the result of the Kowalski experiment.
8 months later, after endless busted knuckles and frustration, the kid finally got the engine running. He took his girlfriend to prom in that Chevy Nova, and according to Riker, they are happily married today.
Incredible.
Riker backs this up with a study from the Journal of Marriage and Family showing that sons who were taught conflict resolution through physical, mechanical tasks like rebuilding engines or carpentry scored 30% higher in adult marital communication than sons raised in purely talk therapy households.
Because they learned how to diagnose a problem objectively, rather than just emoting about it.
Yeah.
That leads right into the story of the Texas teenager and the Greek breakup scroll.
This is Riker's favorite example of enforcing the sacred text portion of the triad. A father in Texas caught his teenage son attempting to break up with his girlfriend by ghosting her, just sending a vague text and blocking her number. The modern coward's way out.
The father intercepts the phone. What does he do?
The father hands the kid a sheet of papyrus paper, a pen, and a Greek lexicon. He tells his son, "The apostles didn't ghost people, they wrote epistles, in Greek, and they signed their names to them. He forced his son to spend 3 hours sitting at the kitchen table, translating his thoughts and drafting a formal breakup letter in Koine Greek. He then made him hand-deliver it.
That is deeply humiliating for a teenager.
It is entirely humiliating, but again, Riker calls it programming clarity, not cruelty. By forcing his son to do something incredibly difficult, slow, and accountable, the father broke his son's modern entitlement. Riker's point is simple. If a father does not break his son's entitlement himself, the corporate world or the legal system will break his spirit later, and they will not do it with love.
It is about enforcing accountability. And Riker applies this uncompromising accountability directly to marriage as well. He fiercely warns against the modern egalitarian marriage model.
Riker tells the cautionary tale of a Silicon Valley startup founder who ignored all ancient hierarchical wisdom. This founder decided to marry his chief financial officer, believing they could run the company and the marriage as absolute, 50-50 egalitarian partners in all domains.
A completely flattened hierarchy at home and at work, and the result.
According to the internal metrics Riker accessed, their combined productivity cratered by 53% within a year. The constant need for consensus on every single decision, both domestic and corporate, led to massive decision fatigue and resentment, ultimately causing the startup to implode.
Riker contrasts this modern failure with a bizarre piece of history, the 4th century Antioch's Virgin riots.
Yes. In 4th century Antioch, massive groups of women actually rioted against the Roman state's system of arranged egalitarian contract-based marriages. Riker claims that early Christian texts, like the Acts of Paul and Thecla, supported these women because they exposed the Roman marriage model for what it was: a tax farming scheme designed to create compliant dual-income households that the state could easily tax and manage.
So Riker's arguing that the church didn't ban the Acts of Thecla because they hated women. They banned it because it threatened the Roman tax base by encouraging people to opt out of the state-managed marriage machine.
Exactly. Riker's ultimate conclusion on marriage is that when natural complementary hierarchies are dismantled in the name of equality, you don't get utopia. You get a bureaucratic nightmare where the state and the HR department ultimately foot the bill, while the individuals are left exhausted and paralyzed.
Wow. We have covered an incredible amount of ground today. This is a massive, intense journey Riker has taken the reader on. We have excavated the Vatican archives with Swiss mercenaries. We have analyzed the neurochemistry of blood rituals in Afghan war zones and Sicilian shipping ports.
We really have.
We have exposed the Gnostic war machines operating inside modern HR departments. We have looked at how to biohack your endocrine system against modern toxins, and we have laid out a brutal historical blueprint for raising sons with carburetors and Greek scrolls.
And through every single one of those examples, Riker's core premise remains aggressively consistent. He firmly believes that restoring an unapologetic, historically grounded, and biologically real masculine hierarchy is the absolute only way to save Western civilization from imminent collapse.
Before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to pose one final provocative thought for you, the listener, to mull over. Something that builds on the foundation of Riker's material, but maybe pushes it just one step further into the unknown.
If we step back and connect all these historical dots, we have to ask a deeply ironic question. What if the ultimate result of institutional censorship isn't erasure, but anti-fragility? Think back to the French archivists in 1242 burning those 14,000 apocryphal scrolls. Modern researchers using multispectral imaging have actually been able to read some of those lost texts because the words were preserved in the carbon smoke stains baked into the stone walls of the incinerator rooms.
That's amazing.
Riker's ultimate, perhaps unspoken, lesson might be this. By trying to burn, ban, and erase this masculine operating system, the elites didn't destroy it. They subjected it to extreme heat and pressure, and in doing so, they accidentally baked it permanently into the foundation of history. It survives today precisely because it was attacked.
That is an incredibly powerful image to leave on. The truth, permanently preserved in the smoke on the walls of the institutions that tried to destroy it. Thank you so much for taking this incredibly intense, uncompromising deep dive with us today. As always, please remember to like and subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an analysis. We explicitly encourage you to go right now to Amazon Kindle and Google Playbooks to buy Catholic Apocrypha, uncovered by Conrad Riker. You really need to read this source material for yourself. And be sure to follow his ongoing research at Conrad Riker at Substack.
It is a text that forces you to completely reevaluate the foundations of modern institutional thinking and your own biological reality.
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
So until next time, keep questioning the blueprint. And remember, sometimes the institutional X-ray machine is deliberately broken, and you have to dig through the mud, the blood, and the ancient text yourself to find the truth.